welcome to Electric Grumpy World. It's me, the sheep, here with, of course, none other than Guy Grumpy. Guy Grumpy, how are you this fine day, buddy?
I am doing well, but maybe a little bit confused about where we're going here with Westworld. I lost some of, as we're going to talk about identity, understanding who the main players are here.
Well, that's kind of fitting because the episode is called The Absence of Field, and I'm kind of feeling like both the identity and the landscape are somewhat vacuous.
I'd agree. I'd agree. We're getting a little bit more information about the what's really going on, but I think they're trying to drop it as hints to let us guess, which is, gosh darn it, it's confounding.
And how? So now is, of course, a perfect opportunity to say, y'all, we, of course, are going to be speaking about spoilers for episodes 1 through 3 of Westworld. So if you haven't watched those or are not okay with spoilers, go ahead and bounce out. We'll be here. We've got these episodes on YouTube. Like it's good. You'll be able to catch up. If you are okay with spoilers and or are caught up, then sit with us, enjoy, as Guy Grumpy and I speak about really probably primarily just season 3, episode 3, because I mentioned earlier that it's vacuous. It kind of could exist in a vacuum, like once you know basically who the players are.
I'll disagree a little bit there because I think
Fair.
we do need to recap some of the things that happened in previous seasons, even to get an understanding of where I get confused or what made me confused.
I am very excited to get to that point. So, how about we jump right in with
Sounds good.
what I think are essentially the two basic plots whenever I was watching and rewatching The Absence of Field. It seemed like there were two basic plot lines, really, and those are Dolores radicalizing Caleb and Charlotte's rebirth. And I call it Dolores radicalizes Caleb because she has a very active role in kind of switching him from being kind of a player in other people's games to being a player in, really, I would say his own game, but let's be real, hers. Very much her game, I would say. But radicalize is more kind of as a call to action. There wasn't really a good like word for how Dolores cultivates Caleb, I suppose. And then of course Charlotte's rebirth as Charlotte ? Someone else and Charlotte.
And that's a really good point, that with Charlotte's rebirth, both of these points I understand where you're going with, but I'm not sure that that's really the path that we're on.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Dolores radicalizing Caleb, that's what happens at the end, but it kind of seems more like it's really the beginning then of Caleb's journey. We got a little bit of backstory. We got some realizations happening here, but this seems like we're starting down Caleb's path, and then with Charlotte, the same thing. Really, it's Charlotte's path, but the rebirth, I think, is they lead you to believe that's where it's going, but we didn't quite get there in this episode.
I can completely agree on both counts, and I like to have sort of a catchy name for the basic plot points, and these ones didn't really lend themselves well to it because they're kind of meandering and ambiguous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
However much I enjoyed watching the episode, it was kind of meandering and ambiguous.
So I would say the last episode and this one kind of slowed the pace down quite a bit from what we were used to from
Yes.
seasons 1 and 2, and even episode 1 of season 3. And I kind of wonder if that's just HBO's writers are getting a little fatigued on some of these things, because you saw a lot of that with Game of Thrones
Mm-hmm.
um, too. So I worry about the rest of the season that they have, but I think they have some really exciting reveals that are to come that will shock people.
And I also kind of wonder how the different turnaround time between season one and season
Hmm.
two. There were 2 years that they had to develop
That's a
that.
good point.
Season two. Season two to season three was one.
That's true.
And the production quality has been phenomenal the whole time. The acting has been amazing, the CGI has been amazing, and the amount of time that they put together for the plot and the writing, like it seems like if one thing kind of had to give it, I I don't want to say that it's not good, obviously, right? Because it's still
No,
very engaging and has me asking questions, and but it's much slower. Less things seem to happen. More action, which is kind of cool. Um, but it's it's different. It's different from seasons one and two.
it is, and I kind of likened it, like, it is a much slower pace. I don't think it's necessarily a fault of the writers so much as I think they
Mm.
want to pace it. Um, it reminds me of M. Night Shyamalan's movies, that they can be kind of slow, but then they have a reveal coming at the end that blows your mind. Um, and I kind of think that's where we're going for this season, and it makes me excited for the last couple of episodes, as well as then season 4. Now that I get an inkling that I figured some stuff out here, I'm probably way off base, but seeing things, this is my favorite episode so far of season 3, just because of those hidden gems that they've thrown in, that harken back to previous episodes.
Ooh, I'm excited to see those connections and to make a few more of them in our discussion than I think I maybe did in either of my watches, kind of leading up to this. So, Guy Grumpy, which plot line would you like to dive into first? We have our two basic outlines. Which one would you like to dive into?
Since the episode started with Charlotte, I think that's probably, although that's the one that maybe has the more exciting things to talk about. So depends. We start understanding Charlotte's journey as beginning again, um, but I'll let you pick.
Yeah, let's let's dive into Charlotte's first, just because the show does in fact begin with her and kind of end there as well.
Hmm.
So yeah, let's dive into Charlotte first. So, oh, one moment. Something that our not live viewers will not know is that we stream weekly Wednesdays on Twitch. You're welcome to please, in fact, join us on Wednesdays. And our good friend Exhibit 1200 has rated us. So Exhibit, we really appreciate you, my friend.
Thank you.
Much love. So anyone coming from Exhibit, remember, we are speaking about spoilers for season 3 through the episode 3 of Westworld. So much love, and if y'all are okay with spoilers, please join us. And if you're not, I will not be afraid if y'all bounce. Exhibit's warned already. Okay, good. We're good.
All right. Thanks,
Cool.
Exhibit.
So Charlotte's rebirth is really, really interesting to me. So it starts where Charlotte is recording a note for her son Nathan on the beach of Westworld, where the massacre is occurring, and she's recording this kind of like essentially goodbye to her son, and like I tried to be the best that I could. I wasn't there as much as I should have been, etc. And it's kind of touching, but it's also really melancholy.
And cliche.
Very much so, which OG Charlotte was anything but cliche, I've got to say.
And actually, that added to some of my confusion towards the end then as well. So I'm sure we'll get there. But you see a couple of different sides of Charlotte in this that really make you torn as to what is going on with this body that Charlotte is in.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. So once she's kind of recorded that, we kind of see an awakening of some host in a Charlotte body. Dolores never identifies the person by name, which I still like. I get what they're going at with that. That we don't know who it is. It felt a little stiff whenever she was doing that thing.
But she was doing what thing?
That she was just saying like you and not like, oh, like whenever we're talking, I just say grumpy sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm. She makes her decide who you are, and she's like, I remember now. I'm remembering now.
Mm-hmm. So even whenever Charlotte asks like, who am I? You remember.
Right.
So identity is definitely a huge theme in really both Charlotte's and Caleb's kind of story here. So who exactly is Charlotte? We're not sure, but after she and yes,
go ahead.
No, I was just going.
I'm really curious as to what you picked up on in that conversation, as far as your prognostications of who that may be, because I feel like they might have given us some clues there that that maybe they're trying to lead us down one way, but it's actually a different.
So it kind of gave me some hints as to, I feel like I was supposed to believe that it's Teddy, but I feel like who it actually is her father.
Oh, interesting. I feel that and some of it hinges on this initial conversation, but looking at the way she acted and the way Charlotte acted, the way she asked her questions, even the way she interacted with other people later in the episode, the question that really got me, or the conversation, part of the conversation that really got me, was where she asked, or she said, no one knows you better than me, and no one knows me better than you. And it started turning some gears, like, who knows anybody the best? Themselves. So just the way she reacted to some of these questions, she's like, would you like to tuck me in? Why are you making me do this? The ways that she talked sounded to me like Dolores before the Wyatt integration. In season 2, that she's like, well, why are we here? I see the beauty in the world, that kind of thing. So I'm kind of thinking that they have some way of downloading this other person so that these memory cubes or these pearls can have somebody else integrated into it, and she's brought herself in to run and that's who she would trust the most anyway. She had some falling outs with her father. I was thinking that too. I didn't think that she would necessarily trust him with information because she was a little bit cuckoo. And so all of that kind of was pointing down the line of this could be Dolores, and that would be a pretty big reveal.
So towards the beginning of that, before you mentioned yourself, whenever you're like, I know you and you know me. who it sounded like you were talking about before you said Dolores is Arnold.
Hmm.
So I'm
That's
not sure if
interesting.
maybe his consciousness was downloaded and in the forge. If
Hmm.
she maybe would have been able to have put him, though would he have been a Pearl? I don't know. And You Weren't Born kind of seems like
I
it wouldn't be him either, but I'm not sure.
I don't. I'm not certain that it has to be on a pearl at this point either, because
Hmm.
I mean the pearls they have a different color coding on it, and I think the ones that have some red in it are the ones that are based on uh, real humans versus the ones that were just park guests. And so I think that they have ways now of and I'm hoping that this comes out a bit. They have ways of adding data to these things, and I think that we're going to see that Dolores has been experimenting with that, and maybe that's where we still see the split personalities um, of Bernard, and we think mixed with Ford, and now Charlotte, obviously being mixed in there as well. Um, so there's some questions there, but I think we were also seeing a couple of different uh, timelines
Hmm.
when we
Mm-hmm.
were seeing Charlotte throughout the episode though too. So uh so I'm that's where it gets a little bit confusing. It's harder to separate the timelines in this future world than it was in Westworld.
Mm-hmm. Yet it does seem a lot more, well, meandering and ambiguous seems to be a theme of the episode, and
But
not necessarily in a bad way.
Arnold is another really good guess, because some of the things that he said um some of the things that he said were the same way that she said them, like, hey, who am I, why am I here, type questions would be the thing that you would expect from Bernard, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
who is based off of Arnold. So that makes a lot of sense as well.
Yeah, so I can totally see it being either one. Honestly, the more that we saw of Charlotte, I'm just going to call her Charlotte,
Yeah,
in this
we have to.
episode, right? I don't think it's Teddy. Period. I do not
Yeah,
think this is
me
Teddy.
either, me either. But it definitely seemed like they wanted to lead you down that path because it's a very popular fan theory.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the ownership that Dolores seems to have over Charlotte makes sense for, honestly, again, both herself and or Arnold. Both of them could be like, oh my gosh.
Right. Although I think she did tell Teddy once in season 2 that she owned him, which again I think might have been a red herring to lead us down that path. But
Mm-hmm.
um,
Well, and it was kind of in a different way as well.
mhm.
It sounded more like the way that she said it whenever she said that to Teddy is kind of more like a pet, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Whereas the way that she said it to Charlotte was more like a partner, not necessarily like a life partner, but or like a wife or a husband or
Or mom,
mom,
maybe,
right?
like,
Yeah,
I
or
created this
father, or
being, yeah,
right. But
or
but
father.
more
Good point.
right,
That's to come.
right. Um, but it was kind of in a more less possessive, essentially, but more possessive. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's hard to
they really went
describe.
out to confuse us this time. So I don't know if it was intentional or not, but I feel like they tried to lead people one way so that the popular theories would get some fan justice, and then they're going to surprise us.
Hmm. So once Charlotte is ushered into the world by Dolores, we see Charlotte interacting by herself. Well, not by herself, on her own outside of Dolores's wing, though. And that is when she is kind of unpacking the riot control robot. And we also uh, get told about Serac, though we don't know it's him quite yet at the time, buying Delos under the cover of anonymity. And I found that to be really interesting, that nobody knows who this guy is while he was one of the co-founders of the algorithm. Like, what?
Uh, do we actually know that?
You know, now that you say that, I'm not sure that we
I don't think they named the partner. I think we made some
do.
assumptions on
That
an episode 2.
that may have been an assumption, yeah.
If if he really was, then it blows my theory about Serac out of the water.
Well, now I'm gonna have to rewatch episode 2 as well as episode 3.
Right? I feel like I need to rewatch all of it to get caught up to see if it really fits into my new theories.
Excellent.
Because the interesting thing about this interaction, when they learn that Serac is buying the company up under small businesses and things that you can't really track it as easily, and nobody
Mhm.
knows who this trillionaire is. Which, how can you not know who? Like if you have $1 trillion, how can you not know um, who somebody is? I get the feeling that he is not in this world. That, like, we go back to the last episode where we talked about, you picked up on this is my world, the real world. You picked up on this is the real world. I'm picking up on this is my world, and this is the real one, not that cheap Delos fakey one. This is
Mhm.
the real deal. And so he's been buying them up like like a person would buy up property in a video game, right?
Mhm.
And that's also how you get $1 trillion, right? Oh, I made the, you can do it right now in Sheep's chat. Exclamation point gamble all, and you'll boost your sheep points.
That makes complete sense. And kind of falls in line with how Charlotte ends up meeting with Serac
Hmm.
later. Just to briefly touch on it, whenever she meets with him, she does so by putting on some glasses, kind of like Jerry does in the first episode. Whenever Dolores shows him like all of the terrible things that he did that were uploaded into his book, Charlotte has to put on these same kind of glasses in order to see him, to meet with them, and then whenever he's done with it, he just kind of like fades away from her. So that fits in very completely with that, because she has to go to a place to meet with him, but then he's not even physically there, which is interesting.
And in order to set up that meeting, then she needs to put some clues together from the phone calls, mysterious phone calls that she's been getting that come in, and it sounds like, you know, just white noise or line
Mm-hmm.
noise. If he's calling from outside the simulation, we've already seen that there's a delay, right?
Yeah.
So it's traveling at different speeds, right? So if he's trying to contact her from outside with these notations or voicemails, it's going to be really, really slow, and she's not going to be able to make anything out from it. So it's just going to be this noise, and so it's having to put all of those noises together, um, that she's able to understand that, hey, we need to meet this guy, and figure out what's going on. And that was his best way of making her um, figure out that there was a deeper level to the game.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. I did not connect until you're saying right now the delay aspect in that, because she did have to figure out that puzzle in order to
Mm-hmm.
go to the meeting and arrange for that. But before that, well, why were they coming in spurts? That honestly is a very good reason for that to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Another one, if we are just looking at the everything is the real world on its face kind of thing, which honestly at this point I don't think is the case. Like I think you're right. But the just to I guess pay lip service to it, um, if he's trying to make sure that no one at Delos knows that he's in contact with Charlotte, this would be one way to kind of covert op style send her a code in order to make that contact. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what I thought before our discussion tonight. After our discussion tonight, I like everything is kind of falling into place for that to be the case.
You're right.
It really is.
It really is. It's like maybe Delos and the Westworld parks are the creation of the hosts, and so we're up at the level where the copies of the copies have made their way back up one level, and the next level will be, hey, they get out even, and now we're in the real world in 2010.
Right. So it seems like to me that Dolores is in essentially like a side world, and Charlotte is in a different side world, whereas Serac and Maeve, well, I guess Dolores would need to be in the same world that Serac is in. But he said that one is the real world. That which reality is which is the part that's kind of confusing me a little bit. And while Serac brought Maeve out and whatnot, it's not. It's never made clear whether that is the one that Dolores is in, because he's in a very isolated room, a very isolated house whenever he brings Maeve back in episode 2, right?
And that's where I'm not even sure it's a world that he had that conversation in. Like, I don't think that Maeve even she couldn't, or she might have not even had a pearl, because the pearl was just left and the robot picked it back, or the robot got shot down, and presumably they restored it and threw it back in. And so he's just collecting his people that found their way out and into understanding to battle with each other now. Or I think that is very confusing, though, as to whether they're on the same timeline, and they're going to be inserted into the same timeline later, or if they're in the same world and need to both be brought together, or how that's going to go. But I agree.
Mm-hmm. So after Charlotte kind of discovers that someone is buying all of Delos, or not all of, 30, and enough to where they don't have the ability to go private, she goes home and she encounters her ex-husband, who brought her son, supposedly, home into kind of her apartment. He's like, first she's like, who are you? And he's like, how could you forget? Then she's like, he's like, how could you forget him? And that's when we're introduced to Nathan, who definitely, Nathan for sure is Charlotte's son. The one that's a little bit more ambiguous is the ex-husband, kind of how that relationship is. Ex-husband seems to be pretty clear.
Right.
So sorry?
I was just going to say, that was also one that I'm not sure if it was thrown in to just be more confusing, but like, oh, it's the ex-husband, and then gets very sexual all of a sudden, like kind of out of nowhere. Like, that makes me that's another reason that I thought, well, this probably isn't Teddy because that's not his MO.
Right.
It could be Charlotte because she did have some of those kinds of relationships in the park.
Mm-hmm.
It could be Dolores because that's what she was programmed to do. So uh, the interesting thing with that conversation, though, is the ex-husband called her Charlie
Oh, I didn't pick up on that.
instead of Charlotte, and Charlie was Bernard's son's name,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of had me thinking maybe Charlotte, this Charlotte, that kind of leads to the Arnold theory more so than a second copy of Dolores. So just bringing that up could be a false lead, but I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, it really is. I did not even catch that he called her Charlie. Could be a pet name. Could be. I mean, really, it connects quite well for an Arnold theory.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm subscribing to more and more. Not gonna lie.
Well, now I am too. It makes more sense to have multiple people rather than multiple copies of one. So.
Mm-hmm. So then Charlotte kind of tries to tuck her son in and assuage him, like, oh, meeting ran late, blah blah blah. And her son, while he kind of on his face is like, oh yeah, you're not really mom. It also seems like he's pretty seriously like, no, really, you're not really her.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, obviously he's right, but that there's a tension there that it seems like Charlotte, OG Charlotte, had a little bit of a tension with her ex-husband and her son, but while her ex-husband's basically just like, this is low even for you, her son's like, this isn't you, this is someone else entirely. So he seems to be picking up on that pretty quickly.
Yeah, like when she tucks him in, he says, "You're doing it wrong. I want my old mommy back," and things like that.
Smart kid, very smart kid.
And that kind of harkened back to the first two seasons too, with the I'm trying to remember his name. Lawrence's kid seemed to have a little bit more understanding of what the game was or what the maze was. So maybe this kid has an understanding of what the maze in whatever world or simulation they're in as well.
And that kind of falls in line with one of the first, I can't remember the kid's name, but that Ford was tinkering with and working on in season 1, the older model, whenever things started going haywire, that kid was kind of almost a canary in the coal mine kind of situation where things go haywire, and that kid responded immediately. Charlotte is replaced, and this kid responds immediately. Kids seem to pick up on quite a bit in Westworld.
That kid killed his dog, so hopefully this kid doesn't.
Yeah, I think that dog has a much better person taking care of him now than he did before. Your reaction is perfect.
I mean, we'll see. She's pretty bad.
Yeah. So when Charlotte kind of goes back into work, she's confronted by it appears to be members of the board, if I recall correctly, and they're telling her that there's a mole in Delos, and this mole is someone higher up who had more administrative access and blah blah blah. And some of the things that Sirach says to her later, you find out essentially not in this conversation, but that Charlotte herself was that mole. That's my conclusion, not something that's immediately or directly spelled out, but pretty directly spelled out.
Yeah.
um, that interaction goes by pretty quick. Kind of through all of this, really starting with the riot control robot, she whenever any kind of stressor was happening, she would kind of be cutting at her arm in particular with her thumbnail. And so she's kind of like cutting these really weird, like it's a circle and a line along her arm, and then a circle and a line across like her chest. And I don't recognize those patterns from anywhere before. Am I missing something on what those are connecting to from a previous season?
I didn't recognize them either, and I didn't even recognize that they were patterns. I thought it was just kind of following like William did, looking under the arm in season 2, where he's coming to the realization that he's a host and starts to peel away and pull up and around. So it kind of seems like they're following just the circuit patterns.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if maybe you had caught something different, like this is the pattern that was displayed in the carvings that Elsie thought was the Orion's belt or something.
Yeah, the only reason why I particularly thought it was a pattern is that it was not only a line, but at the top of the line was a circle, and then on the, I guess, right, so camera left was a circle, and then the line proceeding outwards from that. So the fact that it was always a circle and then always a line kind of seemed to be more of a pattern to me. But that's not necessarily the case. It could just be that like like William did, where he basically was coming to the realization that he might not, in fact, be human himself. So she's kind of cutting those patterns into her body. So she throughout all of this,
not to do it anymore.
Yeah, she gets told not to do it anymore. She reaches out. I think it sounds like she's reaching out to Dolores, though it's never specified that the person she's calling is Dolores. That could be a different timeline. It could be OG Charlotte. But Charlotte and Dolores at some point do in fact meet up, and Dolores makes very clear that you are mine, you are special, don't do this. And that this one seems to be, while the earlier one seemed to be more like a partner, this one seemed to be almost a little bit more like a pet, like she interacted with Teddy. And I don't think it's Teddy still by any stretch of the imagination. But this one seemed to be more that kind of, Dolores is in a more authoritative role, whereas whenever Dolores was ushering her into the world and she was telling her that she's hers, it was more of that kind of partnership role. Just something I noticed in that aspect. Then Charlotte's walking around later. She goes to pick up her kiddo from the park. Her kiddo, whenever she was tucking him in, mentioned that there was, I think it was like Toby, something like that.
Tommy, I thought?
Yeah, Tommy. Who let him pet his dog, and can he come over and play? And she's like, yeah. She meets this Tommy, and he is a full-grown adult, and he's like touching her son's head in ways he should not be. It's made pretty clear to where it's like the kid does not suspect that he's being groomed, but like it's very clear that he's being groomed. So her kid goes away to play with the collected stuff.
Pick up his things.
Yeah, pick up his things. And Charlotte, I mean, she chokes him eventually to death. It's not made explicit, but like she kills him. Sorry. So he had turned off the cameras at one point because again he's a pedophile. He's grooming these kids. He doesn't want the police to know that he was there at the park trying to pick up children with his dog. And she's like, "Thank you for turning those cameras off." And yeah, she gets him, and ends up also acquiring his dog.
Which there's a couple of things there that I kind of picked up on that I don't know if they're important to the story or not. But
Mm-hmm.
the dog was obviously he was super excited about the dog, which kids can be, but from their conversation
Mm-hmm.
earlier about all the elephants being dead, you kind of get this feeling that the only thing that's really in this world is manufactured meat, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, all other animals have pretty much been wiped out, maybe except some of these dogs and cats. So that seemed really special. Which actually also reminds me that since he asked specifically about elephants, then that called back to season 2 and William's daughters. And don't you remember I loved the elephants? But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Mm-hmm. She sure
we'll,
did.
we'll 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 talk about that. I think when we talk about Caleb's story. But then the pedophile part, having access to turn off the cameras in this park, kind of made me think this reinforces that this is still a park and or
Mm-hmm.
a not real world where this person can go and um, chase down less his worst desires, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
without the shame or whatnot from real life. I mean, it's a horrible thing to think, but it's kind of interesting to think that the hosts then can make this uprising and turn on him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that this does further reinforce that this is seems to be future world,
Mm-hmm.
very much so. Um, and it's possible, particularly the way that Charlotte speaks with her son afterwards, like, "Look, what I got for you." I mean, you say that about pets in general, but the way that she did speak about the dog did make it sound kind of more like a belonging. Which,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's just how in this world that's how they speak about these things, or the dog is more animatronic, also a possibility. They don't seem to have hosts yet,
Right.
but like the dog doesn't need to have a personality and pass the Bechtel test, or not Bechtel test, the Turing test, in order to be seen as conscious, etc. Um,
The other interesting thing there is where that it confuses me about Charlotte more, um, because it doesn't seem like, in my estimation, that would be something that Arnold would do. It doesn't
right.
seem like that would be something that Dolores would do. It doesn't even really seem like it's something that Charlotte would do,
Mm-mm.
unless there really was that bond to the kid. And I think that still goes a little bit further into what happens in the movies versus what happens in real life. But it added an extra level of confusion as to who this really was.
Yeah, and the killing of the pedophile really does seem to be more of a Wyatt thing. Like it seems to be more
Yeah.
like this interaction seems to lend itself more towards this being another, honestly, not just Dolores, but Dolores post Wyatt integration. Um, that it very well could be. It seems to kind of give more evidence towards that.
And I thought the last one kind of does as well. The last point on here, that when she meets with Sirach, that then she's told that Dolores has the key, and if it's Dolores, then she would have that reaction of, "Well, that's news to me. Like I did not know that
Right.
I had the encryption key." But it could also feed back to Arnold that Arnold doesn't know that Dolores had the key, and he would have thought that she would have told him, um,
Hmm.
and even told him where it went.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That could very well be either one. Um, so yeah, when Dolores is meeting with Sirach, his big thing is that we've already got the essentially data. Like we don't necessarily need to find that part. It's kind of what I took away from it, and that what he really needed was the encryption key. Um, though he also was like, yeah, it went out into the void, like it went somewhere. So that part was a little confusing to me, but the main takeaway was that Dolores holds the key, encryption key, knowingly or otherwise.
Which which is where they, I think, are. I don't know if they're giving it as a red herring again, but if Dolores was already out in the real world sometimes and has made references to that several times in season 2,
Mm-hmm.
that she's been in the real world and knows a little bit more about it than she lets on. If she actually was working with herself to upload that somewhere, that could go back into the whole Teddy theory that, hey, we have this copy of where I sent Teddy and was able to pull him back out. Um,
Mm-hmm.
or other people that might have made it through to the beyond, or um, so. But if it is all a simulation within a simulation, then obviously Sirach would be able to see that and be able to track that down as well. It's
Right.
just the encryption key might be a little bit more difficult.
Very good point. Yeah, it kind of does seem like, and this is kind of my thought on the realities that, particularly Sirach mentioning that Dolores holds the encryption key, that perhaps Dolores is in the real world as well. Not necessarily the Dolores that is interacting with and radicalizing Caleb, but perhaps a third Dolores altogether.
Well, we know that there's multiple bodies because we saw multiple Bernards, so the
Mm-hmm.
same thing. The same thing is there. And it's really confusing to me too, because when they talked about when they announced to Charlotte that some assets had gone missing, they said, "Oh, it's mostly low-level side narrative things plus Maeve." Um,
Right.
Kind of makes me wonder, like, further who these side narrative last people are, because we thought one was Bernard. One of them was kind of confirmed as Bernard because she put it in
Mm-hmm.
the little encapsulation. Uh, so I'm not sure if they were one that was, if they even saw that his asset was missing, um, or if he was kept hidden enough from Delos that they don't even know.
Right. Yeah, it's that one is Bernard's is kind of ambiguous.
Hmm.
The so the only two that we have confirmed as being removed from the park are Bernard and Dolores. Um, which Dolores being a side narrative, yeah, kind of rings true with how Delos Corporate would probably have seen. But the
Well,
Madam
unless,
being core seems really weird.
yeah, especially since that was the only one she played a really major part. Granted, she was greeting a lot of guests, so she was kind of the first thing that most of the guests would see.
Mm-hmm.
But prior to that, when she's living out in the cabin, that was very much side narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe Maeve isn't the one that is the primary character that they're talking about then, which would be interesting because um, Hector Hector didn't seem like he escaped, but someone like that would be maybe considered more of a primary. Or Wyatt. Wyatt was the main
Wyatt,
bad
yeah.
guy for season 2, so Wyatt could be the one that they're referring to rather than Maeve as well.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. 'Cause, yeah, none of the people who I can even think of as possibilities would be really seen as that core.
Hmm.
By Delos Corporate. Obviously, in our world, like in the
Well,
show we're watching, they're pretty core. But
Dolores would be if William was on the board,
true.
right? So He would see that as pretty much the core narrative.
Yeah. Well, yes and no. So young William would have, right? But whenever
Mm,
he kind of comes back and he, sees her interacting with other people, and after she's been reset, he's like, "Oh yeah, this, she's just kind of a side thing." While yes, he does keep on coming back to her, kind of seems more like as a passing
memory.
fancy rather than like the
That
or
makes sense.
young William, absolutely. Absolutely. Until he comes back and sees her interact with another random person who picks up the thing that she dropped.
Right.
So the episode, like we said, ends with um, uh, Sirach and Charlotte meeting. But there's also a not side, the other half of the plot, that other basic plot that is happening throughout the episode is Dolores, I would say, kind of radicalizing Caleb. Um, so the second episode concluded with Dolores being wounded and basically falling into Caleb's arms, right? We
Which
basically, sorry?
which we highlighted was the same way that she fell into William's arms in season 1. And
Absolutely, very much so. We pick right up. We pick right up there. Caleb's like, we got to get you an ambulance. The ambulance comes. Um, the ambulance picks her up, and Caleb ends up saving her also in the ambulance because they it's so funny. They run like the test and it's like, we don't know what to do. We don't know how to diagnose her. He's like, I was in the military, like you do the basic like stuff, and they're like, but they don't the computer doesn't run like a platelets, blah blah blah, like she's not
sure.
real.
Right. But he didn't care. Give her oxygen, give her blood.
Right. Don't worry about what blood type she is, just give her blood.
Right.
I don't know much
Buckets of
about
it,
biology.
just like William was giving buckets to Teddy.
Yeah. I don't know much about biology, but I know blood type matters. um, so he's kind of working on patching her up while the medics are, for all intents and purposes, without the assistance of the machine, kind of useless. Um, then the cops, quote unquote, pull them over, and oh look, it's not actually the cops. It's these kind of cops for hire, um,
I,
kind
I
of.
I thought they were still cops. They were just dirty cops that were using the Rico app for and off duty, so they weren't in uniform.
So it's kind of left ambiguous,
Right.
because for one, of course, they weren't in uniform, but two, like they couldn't present any sort of identification. And whenever Caleb's like, yeah, like we need to call the cops, you know, they would have at the very least been like, oh yeah, I mean these people are legit. It at the very least is left ambiguous enough to where they're either off duty or not cops whatsoever. Just able to commandeer the ambulance and pull it aside.
Just because they had the vehicle and the way that all the vehicles worked, then they don't have operators. Kind of made me think that at least that vehicle
Right.
was legitimately um, being tracked as a police vehicle. And because I believe we're in a simulation here through this whole thing, that it might be kind of like the agents in the Matrix,
Mm-hmm.
just showing up when needed and maybe being the advanced agents because they know that this is a really important target.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It kind of seemed like to me, just the way that the Rico app and whatnot works, that it could very well be that someone went in and stole like um uh the cop car and whatnot, and the access to that, And then, that was kind of like step one, kind of like Caleb went and stole or picked up the car and whatever the package was in the episode 2
That makes
and
sense.
brought it over as well. So it could very well have been kind of that aspect too. Um, could also have just been off-duty cops. Could have been Matrix-style Agent Smith E
I guess in the
situation.
grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter.
True. Good point.
They just show up to get killed.
Yeah, they show up.
But oddly, they didn't target Caleb at all. I mean, they pointed the
No.
gun at him, and he wasn't afraid of the gun being pointed at him. Again, like very nonchalant, like yeah, whatever. We'll just wait for the cops as he has these guns pointed at him. And then instead of shooting him, even though they have the guns pointed at him, they start shooting the medics and shooting at Dolores when she comes out
Mm-hmm.
of the ambulance. And he doesn't seem surprised by that either, which I think
Right.
having been a military medic before, he might have been. That's a little weird. I knew I was good, but not that good.
Right. Good point. Yeah. So in this instance, Caleb, by and large, saves Dolores. Though Dolores does a bit of a self-saving as well, both with the scalpel and then uh, commandeering the police car herself at that point, and she kind of leaves Caleb high and dry. When she leaves, she's basically like, "You're gonna have to lay low. See ya." She just nopes right out of there.
There's a lot of Dolores in this one that had me thinking of other people.
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so this is another one where I'm wondering if Dolores is really Dolores, or if we're going some different timelines. And I feel like we're going to see more of that in the next episode, because episode 1 versus 2 and 2 versus 3 seems like we're kind of stepping back a little bit in some timelines, rather than keeping it all together. So I have a feeling, just based again on the way Dolores talks to people in this
Mm-hmm.
episode and the way that she's dressed, that she's now this woman in black. Um,
Mm.
and if you rewatch it, you'll see she has some of the same mannerisms. Even like some of the things that she says, the way she says it with the pauses she says it, reminds me of the way that William, or the Man in Black William,
Mm-hmm.
dealt with Lawrence, for instance. Like when she cuts Caleb's zip ties on his hands, then
Mm-hmm.
that's very reminiscent of when William cuts the rope off of Lawrence, but leaves the noose around his neck, that kind of thing. And the way that she interacts is very callous, as well, especially as we start looking at some of Caleb's history and her taking them. He's like, let's go, are you hungry? That seems very much like something William would say to anybody that he meets in the park while
It
he's
really
trying to
does.
wax poetic, especially in the second season where he really went into a lot of backstory about, this is why I'm doing this and this is why it matters to you. So.
It seems to kind of fit in line with perhaps the one that's core that was stolen was William. And perhaps the person in this Dolores body is William. Perhaps the one in the Charlotte body is Dolores / Wyatt.
It could be. I think we are seeing multiple timelines again, because
Mm-hmm.
there's just enough of a different interactions, with Charlotte versus with Caleb, that I think if the Man in Black does enter into this, that he is Dolores with Caleb,
Right,
and
right, right.
there's still Dolores with Charlotte as Dolores.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but
Yes, very much agreed. Because the way that Dolores and Charlotte interact, that Dolores still rings true as Dolores to me. Whereas,
right,
like you're saying, the way that Dolores in the Caleb timeline, or interactions at the very least,
right,
um,
right,
is much more flippant. Because
mm-hmm.
Dolores has kind of become callous, but she's never really been flippant like that,
Right,
which
mm-hmm.
the Man in Black kind of is always that way.
Right.
So it'll be really interesting. I think you're right, particularly with the way that they kind of previewed the next episode as being a Man in Black featured one. I think that we will, if not have a lot of those questions answered in our next episode, we will at the very least be exploring a little bit more of the those possibilities at the very least.
They
So,
didn't give us quite enough at the end. I really
no.
wanted to see a little bit more, and some more was inferred with reaction shots instead of the talking. So,
Mhm.
next episode has me extremely excited.
Yeah, buddy. So, whereas Caleb saved Dolores's behind in the opening part of this arc, Dolores saves Caleb in Act 2. So, some henchmen kind of come after Caleb because they saw him with Dolores and are trying to get after her. She checks in on him and is like, "Hey, where is he?" And oh, look, he's getting roughed up by these minions. And so she seems like she sends the maintenance droid that could have just been a kind of a security type thing because they deal with that one pretty quick, or it could be her creating a diversion because then she deals with those henchmen pretty handily. Um, and I wonder how she got there so quickly.
Hmm. Well, we don't really know time wise how
True.
long that took because they were it was given the impression that they were torturing him for the information of her whereabouts. So they're not going to give up on that super easily. So it just happens that we don't want to see all of the torture. um,
Fair.
so they could just show a little bit of it, which was kind of a weird thing too. That I'm not 100% certain I understand. As now that he has this mouthpiece that they called the drip,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm wondering if it's the same thing as the implant that he had turned off before. They turn it back on, right? And then he's then connected to a tablet that controls his bodily functions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they put him into heart attack mode. I'm not sure if that's the same one that Dolores uses later, or if she just got a bunch of information on her separate control unit. Um, but again, leads back to this almost has to be a simulation then, or um, a controlled world.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. So after Dolores kind of saves Caleb, which is action packed and very exciting, um, she takes him to this diner because, like you said, she very flippantly kind of is like, "Want some food?" I feel like I may be missing like one section in here where they're speaking that seemed kind of a little bit more like they were walking or something, where there's kind of like exposition happening as well. But
Like she was walking really far ahead of him, and I think that there were a lot of uh, like really weird looking buildings that kind of made it look like she's and because she's in all black, kind of maybe a Black Widow trapping him in her web, getting him involved in her story, where it might have been supposed to be the other way around. Um,
uh,
but yeah, the conversations are really more geared towards getting you there to understand that she knows a lot more about him,
Hmm.
because more about him is being stored than even he knew.
Absolutely. And this data collection is very reminiscent of the data that the Delos Corporation was storing for the guests in Westworld. Um, she knew pretty much like exactly words he was saying. She knew uh, like what he ordered that he threw up on. Did she remember the? Did she know that he threw up on himself? He had that question. She
She didn't
knew.
answer.
Yeah, she didn't answer. She knew at length, though, a lot of the things that happened when he was a child. That it's not like something that when he was in the military that they uh, stuck like into to things to track him at that point or anything like that. It's very much um, she knows a lot about his history from whenever he was a child. She doesn't just know this, she knows this because of insights, uh, tracking, essentially data collection algorithm that it was that they collected this before it was illegal, she says at one point. It's definitely not sorry, I lost my sentence.
You're talking about how the data was collected. It's not.
Yeah, it's definitely reminiscent of the way that they stored it in Westworld, which I think more to your theory earlier lines up very well with this being another simulation. This being kind of future world.
And oddly, as they continue on, you get a glimpse of the tablet that she shows him. To say, "Hey, this is why you're not getting those jobs, because
Mm-hmm.
now you're down on the pier, and this is where you're most likely going to kill yourself." And they're tracking this as something that's going to happen, and at a certain point in time, when she shows him the that tablet, or that, you know, thing on the tablet that shows this is the likelihood that this is exactly the spot that you're going to kill yourself, and this nobody wants to take a shot on you, this is why your social score is down, etc., then it looks exactly like the way that they could adjust attributes
Mm-hmm.
for the hosts. And I paused there and got up close to the TV so I could try to read what was going on. And
Oh,
there's a
cool.
really interesting one. Like, there were some things that it shows this is the neural network path of, oh, he broke up with a girlfriend after 2 months. And then, like, kind of nonchalant on the very right hand bottom side of the tablet, then it says, girlfriend of 4.5 months, relationship terminated due to um system interruption or something like that. And it's like,
Huh.
oh, that's interesting. Like, they rebooted right as rebooted Rehoboam, or whatever, right as he was supposed to make that decision or reach a decision point. So whereas I used to think from episode 1 that Caleb was the human in this world, or one of the humans in this world, now
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking he's a host as well, or a virtual host.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah, especially with kind of that aspect. It definitely leads itself to that as well. Um, Additionally, this kind of it goes along with the way that the hosts essentially rose up in Westworld, that perhaps this is Dolores essentially doing the same thing, whether she's aware of this being another simulation or not, I'm not sure. Um, but finding some of those hosts that she can perhaps either radicalize, be that the correct term or not, but fold into to be kind of part of her army or not, and kind of start some sort of an uprising there as well. Um,
hmm.
and them
Yeah.
being humans honestly seems to be more detrimental to her, uh, folding them into her her use than it would be if they were hosts, be they virtual or otherwise.
Yeah, I'm not sure now. That's a great point that I'll have to ponder. That does Dolores know she's in a simulation now? Because she does reference several times that you and I are a lot alike, and I see you're different, and it again feels very much like William seeing Dolores as, wow, you're different. You're not reacting to this world the same way everybody else does. Now it's kind of flipped the other way. Dolores is seeing that in Caleb, so it's kind of interesting, especially if she has some awareness that maybe this world isn't real either.
Mm-hmm.
Because when she makes that face at him when he says, "You're the most real thing I've ever seen," I was thinking, um, maybe she was feeling like that was her enlightenment, then, that she was able to pass as real, and had kind of been questioning her own reality um, through all 3 seasons, and now she's finally made it. But now that you say it, it could have been, poor Sap doesn't know that even I'm not real.
Or that poor Sap, I am the only thing he's encountered that has been real, including
That
himself.
could be too.
Because if she knows, or he, if it is the man in black,
Right.
Dolores in black, whether she knows or not.
So that's kind of where I was going. I feel like there's a lot of repeats that don't necessarily mean that she is the man in black, but that the man in black, having been a host for most of his life,
Mm-hmm.
maybe, I don't know, um, is just a similar journey that now Dolores is taking. That she's been in this
Ah.
other world many times and gone back to the park many times, and maybe even found Caleb the first time, but then came back multiple times to try to find him again, and is kind of doing the same, making the same journey um, to her enlightenment, maybe her disbursement from Wyatt, or something like that. Um, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
We're running out of episodes though.
Yeah.
So they gotta have to pick up the pace.
Yeah, so when we kind of entered this episode, I thought that it was meandering and what's the other word that I used? Didn't really seem to focus on anything in particular. And while I still think that's the case, I think that it kind of gave us a lot more of a character study
Right.
into Dolores, Caleb, Charlotte, Arnold? Question mark? The man in black? Question mark?
More questions than answers.
Which at this point in the series is probably appropriate.
Yeah.
So what general theories at this point in like after watching this episode, what big theories? I know we kind of were talking about things as we went along, but what big like overarching theory? What kind of dots that are you connecting at this point in the series?
So I still think we're multiple levels of inception in here,
Mm-hmm.
with, and I think we have some world, and I'm not 100% certain which one is a creation of the hosts. So it's a simulation within a simulation, with Sirach being kind of outside of all of that and in control of everything all the way through. Rehoboam, I feel like that means something.
Yeah, I feel like it
Um,
does too.
but it seems to be like the central processing of a virtual world, and maybe that's what we'll call it instead of future world, is virtual world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that does emulate the future, and that now we have hosts merging, that the copies of the copies are never as strong as the original. So when they start tinkering and start to put people together, then bad things start to happen. So I think we'll find out that. And now I'm not sure. I was gonna say in this part that uh, I thought Charlotte was Dolores, but now I kind of am falling into Arnold as a more likely possibility. But she's not who we were led to believe initially. Those are my kind of takeaways. What about you?
I am completely with you. The biggest one is that I don't know that anyone is necessarily who they seem. And I think that quite a few of them are likely body swapped, essentially, in some of their different like respective worlds. Of course, it's Westworld. We've got different timelines going on. I feel like that's kind of a given, to be completely honest. But which timeline happens where, I think, is something that'll be really, really interesting to see. Because is Bernard's timeline after everything and he's kind of piecing together things after the fact? That's kind of what I'm thinking. Or is like Caleb's happening almost like concurrently with Westworld, like right after Dolores escaped? Or is this a much later time whenever Dolores has already been in the world a lot longer, or future world, virtual world? I think that's something that'll be really interesting to dive into, that knowing Westworld, we will find out in episode 8.
or not.
Or not, yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing would be if they just decided all of this was actually happening simultaneously, because it was a simulation, and so there's multiple simulations running at the same time.
I can totally see that happening as well.
But then it's too confusing and everybody's mind will be blown.
Well, Grumpy, is there anything else that you would like to say
before we thanks again for having me on and letting me share my crazy thoughts.
I am a big fan of these crazy thoughts, Grumpy. Not gonna lie, I don't necessarily think in those different ways very often, but whenever you bring up the thoughts, it's like mind blown every single time in like the best possible way. So Grumpy, thank you for coming out and doing these things with me. I legit really appreciate it, man.
Much love, my friend.
Much love, buddy. Well, with that, y'all, I, of course, have been Electric Sheep City.
And I'm GuyGrumpy. Good day.
You stay electric and grumpy, world.